episode 487 of the Bowery Boys, the Knicks and the Knickerbockers.
Hey, it's the Bowery Boys.
Hey.
Hi there, welcome to the Bowery Boys. This is Greg Young.
And this is Tom Myers with an emergency late-breaking news podcast, Greg. New York history. New York history is being made right now.
Yes, for the first time since 1999, the New York Knicks have made it to the NBA Finals, and the city, trust me, has never been more energized. We're repainting subway stations blue and orange. Everyone is so excited here, including many people who actually don't often follow basketball.
You mean like yours truly? No, everybody right now, it seems, is wearing the colors of New Netherland. Let's face it, even without even knowing it.
I know. Except our listeners know, of course.
Well, exactly. And on today's show, we are going to be looking at this important moment through a very Bowery Boys lens. Now, we have spoken before about how, the names of New York's big sporting franchises have these historical roots, including the New York Yankees and the Mets, or rather the Metropolitans, or the New York Jets football team, which got its name back in 1963 because its home stadium in Queens was located right near LaGuardia Airport.
Even teams that are no longer in New York have ties to New York City history, like the Los Angeles Dodgers, which used to be the Brooklyn Dodgers, which got its name from the Trolley Dodgers, after the fans who literally dodged street trolleys in order to get to the stadium. But perhaps no sporting team has a more perfectly New York name than the New York Knicks, which that team was founded in 1946.
Or should we say the New York Knickerbockers. Now, the Knicks were born at Madison Square Garden, not the one that is sitting atop Penn Station today, but an earlier MSG that was at 8th Avenue and 49th Street. Because, of course, there have been a few Madison Square Gardens.
There have 4 or even 5, actually, depending on how you count them. And today, the Knicks are known for their wild home games at MSG with celebrities lining the courtside like Spike Lee, Tracy Morgan, Ben Stiller, Timothy Chalamet. But if you look very closely, there is another celebrity standing and smiling over them all, and that is the ghost of Washington Irving.
Now, we know it's a little bit early to be getting in the ghost story mood, everybody. And side note, the tickets for our upcoming Ghost Stories live at Joe's Pub will be going on sale soon. But seriously, you're not talking about an actual ghost of Washington Irving here.
No, I guess what I mean is the spirit of the great writer, Washington Irving, famous for his stories like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle, and one of the first great American writers. Believe it or not, we wouldn't have the New York Knicks without him.
So, yeah. As you can already hear so far in the show, if you came here for a deep dive in basketball history, you might want to check out ESPN or Sports Illustrated or the Bleacher Report, because today we are going to be talking about it in terms of, well, literature and society, and we'll be talking about glamorous hotels and baggy knee breeches. I can't even say it. Baggy knee breeches. We're talking breeches, Greg.
Breeches.
And naming contests. We have a totally different take on the story.
And we'll be doing so in a fashion that we are actually most familiar, beginning our story in Old Dutch New Amsterdam, the precursor settlement to New York City, which inhabited the island of Manhattan in the early 17th century, and the region of New Netherland, which comprised areas along the Hudson River Valley, Long Island, Connecticut, and New Jersey.
So 2 years ago, the two of us, along with our producer, Kieran Gannon, traveled to the Netherlands to trace New York's Dutch roots. And we recorded in the cities of Amsterdam, Leiden, Haarlem, Greg, and other places as part of our 4-part New Amsterdam miniseries. And we learned so much about America's Dutch roots and about some really significant names that have Dutch origins, like Stuyvesant, Bleecker, Beekman, Bayard, even Vanderbilt.
And so it's pretty odd that the old Dutch New Amsterdam name that Americans are probably most familiar with today, the name Knickerbocker, is a name that was not present or prominent in any way for most of the duration of New Amsterdam.
So stop there. Are you saying then that there were no Knickerbockers in New Amsterdam?
Well, the closest we have to an actual Dutch Knickerbocker is a man named Herman Janssen van Wee, whose descendants would gradually adopt the surname Knickerbocker, which morphed into Knickerbocker.
Okay.
So he settled in the area of Albany in the late 17th century because, even then, under English rule, it was still very, very, very Dutch around here.
Yeah, as a reminder, even though the Dutch government had lost control of the entire colony in 1664, most of the Dutch settlers continued living here. They stayed put, including, of course, the last Director General, Peter Stuyvesant. And there would be Dutch enclaves all over New York State for a very long time, even villages that predominantly spoke Dutch. And Dutch family names, of course, would continue to be prominent in the city of New York for centuries, really.
So it makes sense that some Dutch settlers would still come to the area, after this point, even though, it was an English colony by this point.
Right. Okay, so this family, you said Herman Janssen van Wee, this little family, whose name would somehow change to Knickerbocker.
Right.
How did they come over? What's the story here? And where did that name come from?
Well, now, it is a bit of a mystery to this day, Tom, but here's one very charming theory that actually I found. It may come from the Dutch word knikker, meaning a child's playing marble, right? So like a marble that children play with. Now, back in 1903, a Dutch reader of the New York Times wrote into that newspaper explaining that in his youth, a cheap marble baked from common clay by a potter was called a pottenbakker Knicker to set it apart from the more expensive marbles that were made. And so he wondered, quote, may not one draw the conclusion from this that Herman Janssen may have baked marbles and therefore may have been called the marble baker or the Knicker baker?
May one not draw the conclusion that perhaps this writer has lost his marbles?
Possibly.
But hold on. So according to this theory then, Knickerbocker is a marble baker.
That's just one theory, yes.
Okay. And a theory that coincidentally, by the way, traces the origins of Knickerbocker back to a game that's played with little balls. Fits right into the story.
Marbles back then and basketballs today.
Okay, so however they did wind up with that name, the Knickerbocker family was real and was quite small, and they were not actually situated in New York City.
No, the Knickerbocker family was actually centered in Schaghticoke in Rensselaer County, so north of Albany. And today, you can even visit the Knickerbocker Mansion there, which was built in the 1780s by Johannes Knickerbocker III. Now, Johannes had a son named Herman, and Herman is the secret to this entire story.
Herman Knickerbocker.
Yes, or Herman, yes.
Herman. Okay, we'll remember that name.
In fact, he would be known as the Prince of Schaghticoke, one of the town's most famous men, it comes to turn out, a gracious host, a town wit, and even, in fact, a U.S. congressman representing the state of New York.
Oh.
Because he was a prominent Federalist and lawyer of his day, he had many famous acquaintances throughout New York, including a very young writer named Washington Irving.
Here he is, Washington Irving, who was one of America's earliest best-selling authors, and really the man who is responsible for today's story. And unlike Herman Knickerbocker, Irving was actually born in New York City.
In fact, on April 3rd, 1783, a fortuitous time in our nation's history, Irving was, as you could tell, named for George Washington. Well, now flash forward in the story to 1798 when he was 15 years old and when a devastating yellow fever epidemic swept over the city. So Washington was sent up to live with his friend James Paulding in Tarrytown on the Hudson River. Quoting from biographer Brian J. Jones, the young men, quote, explored the eastern shores of the Hudson and hunted squirrels in the woods surrounding a nearby Dutch village called Sleepy Hollow. In the afternoons, Paulding's grandfather read aloud from his enormous Dutch Bible with gigantic silver clasps. It all appealed strongly to Irving, this throwback to quaint traditions and old styles, unquote.
He obviously fell in love with this part of the state because it became the setting of some of his greatest works, including The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And Irving would later live in Tarrytown, New York, in a gorgeous home that he called Sunnyside, which you can still visit today.
Well, young Washington Irving became a bit of a raconteur almost immediately, and he began writing letters for a New York newspaper under the pen name Jonathan Oldstyle. So he was like, into vintage things, I guess we could say.
An old soul.
Yes. Then he went to Europe for a couple of years, which only made him even more sardonic and witty. You could just imagine, stir that into the pot a little bit. Well, so he returned then to New York, where in 1807, in his early 20s, he began producing a satirical magazine called Salmagundi.
Salmagundi. So today on Lower Fifth Avenue in Greenwich Village, there is a fine arts social club named the Salmagundi Club, which pays tribute to this very publication and to Washington Irving and to his lasting influence over all things smart and satirical in American culture. So this Salmagundi magazine, it really was a sly satire of New York's politics scene and its social life. He parodied it all.
Yeah, I mean, you might say that even then, he did not write directly at things. He wasn't a direct writer. He always wrote in a jokey, satirical manner in ways that you might see in, like the New Yorker magazine today, for one example. Much of American comedy in any media, maybe this is a big statement to make, but I think it can trace itself back to Irving and his friends here because it was the first real, solid example of major American comedy, writing for Salmagundi. Well, in 1807, in its pages here of this magazine, Irving even coined the word Gotham to mean New York City. To quote from the book Gotham, I thought this was a good place to look for a quote by Mike Wallace and Edwin Burroughs, quote, "The original Gotham, immortalized in proverb and nursery rhyme, was, of course, that old English village whose inhabitants turned aside King John's wrath by pretending to be fools," unquote. Which I think well describes Irving and his cohorts here, right? And explains his lighthearted and sardonic worldview, maybe. And it's from this worldview here that our fictional Knickerbocker is born. For on December 6, 1809, here comes the publication of Irving's long-form satirical work called The History of New York, from the beginning of the world to the end of the Dutch dynasty. This was a book allegedly written by a man named Diedrich Knickerbocker, who would end up becoming the most famous Knickerbocker of all, despite not being a real person.
Diedrich Knickerbocker. was the alleged author of this satirical work of fake history, which was really written by Washington Irving. Do you know if Diedrich was actually based on Irving's real Knickerbocker friend, Herman or Herman Knickerbocker?
It's very likely. I did find a wide variety of anecdotes characterizing this relationship because, people have really given this a lot of thought because of the popularity of the name, this relationship between Herman and Washington Irving. Now, some say that they may have just been mere acquaintances, while others actually suggest that Washington visited the mansion and may have even written some of his greatest works at the mansion. And in an 1872 history by the great Elizabeth Fries Elliott, I also found another fun little anecdote. She wrote of Irving being playfully introduced to the First Lady, Dolly Madison. Quote, Irving was presented to Mrs. Madison by Mr. Herman Knickerbocker as his cousin germain, Diedrich Knickerbocker, unquote.
Presented no less to Dolly Madison.
To Dolly Madison as Diedrich, yes.
Right. He was presented as his fictional character. So this character must have been pretty well known at the time. But was this book, A History of New York, was it completely satire? Was there any actual history in it?
A lot of both, actually. It is a partial parody of a now long forgotten book called The Picture of New York by Samuel Latham Mitchell, which Irving, as you can imagine, found quite stuffy and pretentious and decided to parody it. In Irving's book, real history and cheeky commentary are kind of woven together into this very entertaining, hilarious, and actually classic narrative by this point. Writers from Charles Dickens to Mark Twain all loved this book. It was on all of their bookshelves. They thought it was the funniest book ever written.
Well, and actually when he wrote it, leading up to its publication in 1809, Irving had to fill in some of the factual blanks himself, right? Especially concerning stories regarding the city's Dutch roots and Dutch heritage, because so much of the actual historical record had been erased by the British. It's kind of amazing to think how many New Yorkers at the time, like with Dutch family names, actually knew very little about their New Amsterdam heritage.
On top of, just all of the difficulties of preserving history in any fashion at this particular time. In fact, it's why the New York Historical Society had been founded in 1804, just a few years before. And Tom, did you know that Irving's book, this book here, was even dedicated to the New York Historical Society?
Wow. So despite its satirical tone, it actually did have some real history to it.
Yeah.
Even though it was purportedly written by Diedrich Knickerbocker. Why do you think that this character, this supposed author, this fake author, why do you think he resonated so strongly with readers?
Well, one big reason was actually how the book was promoted, the kind of long, interesting, creative rollout. For a month before the book was released, notices in the newspapers reported that a mysterious man had swept into town and then had promptly disappeared, leaving behind a manuscript in his hotel room. He was described in the New York Evening Post as, quote, a small elderly gentleman dressed in an old black coat and cocked hat by the name of Knickerbocker.
I mean, it sounds very modern. Sounds like a modern publicity stunt, right? And Irving, he hatched this plan himself and he financed it too. So by the time that the book came out, people were already, wondering about this mysterious manuscript and this supposedly vanished elderly author with this old funny Dutch name. Brilliant.
I mean, an author, or I guess really a character who would outlast the memory of the very book from which he emerged, right? I mean, as Charles Dudley Warner would much later write, quote, this little man in knee breeches and cocked hat was the germ of the whole Knickerbocker legend, a fantastic creation, which, in a manner, took the place of history and stamped upon the metropolis of the New World the indelible Knickerbocker name and character. And even now, in the city, it is an undefined patent of distinction to have descent from an old Knickerbocker family.
Well, we'll watch Knickerbocker take on heirs right after this. So in the decades following the book's 1809 release, I think it's safe to say that the term Knickerbocker, derived from Diedrich Knickerbocker, went mainstream.
I mean, that word is a little ridiculous. It's absurd. It's even a mouthful, as we have to say it a million times in this show.
Which one, Diedrich or Knickerbocker?
Knickerbocker. But it also probably helped that this book, when it came out, was a hit.
Yeah, it was widely read at home and abroad. It went through many, many printings, including in England in 1836, with illustrations by the artist George Cruikshank, who drew the author Diedrich Knickerbocker as a craggy old Dutchman wearing loose knee breeches.
Velvet breeches. Mm-hmm. We're going to get back to those breeches in a second, but continue.
Oh, yes, we will. But the point here is that Irving describes Knickerbocker as a kind of old-fashioned eccentric, right? A kind of absent-minded Dutch history professor, really. He's somebody who's dressed from another era. But as the years passed, something really funny happened. That Knickerbocker name started to mean something. Now, in his preface to the book's 1848 printing, Washington Irving marveled about the book's enduring popularity. He wrote, quote, "When I find, after a lapse of nearly 40 years, this haphazard production of my youth still cherished, when I find its very name become a household word and used to give the home stamp to everything recommended for popular acceptation, such as Knickerbocker societies, Knickerbocker insurance companies, Knickerbocker steamboats, Knickerbocker omnibuses, Knickerbocker bread, and Knickerbocker ice. When I find New Yorkers of Dutch descent priding themselves upon being genuine Knickerbockers, I please myself with the persuasion that I have struck the right chord, and that, though other histories of New York may take their dignified and appropriate rank in the family library, Knickerbocker's history will still be received with good-humored indulgence and be thumbed and chuckled over by the family fireside."
So what exactly happened here? I mean, we know that this was a character. Mm-hmm. So how did Knickerbocker become mainstream? Wait, did you say Knickerbocker omnibuses? Bread?
Knickerbocker ice? Yes.
How did this happen?
So I think that as the decades passed, the farce that was surrounding Diedrich Knickerbocker seems to have faded a little bit, right? And instead, his family name, Knickerbocker, started to represent something different. It still had a little fuddy-duddy, an old-fashioned ring to it. But more importantly, the name started to represent the old world and a Dutch lineage. It could even carry a claim to a sort of, New York, New Amsterdam, New Netherland aristocracy. So
now in just like a few decades, in the first half of the 19th century, so really not that long of a period, Knickerbocker was representing status, as in like descended from the very first Dutch settlers.
Hello, Schermerhorns and Schuyler's and Stuyvesants. Van Rensselaers, Greg. Yes, these became known as the old Knickerbocker families.
Roosevelts, Van Cortlands, and all the rest of them.
Right. Yes. But the thing is, then it kept evolving. Yeah. Because soon its definition was sort of widened to also allow in New Yorkers of English extraction. The wealthy ones, at least.
So now anyone with money who had Anglo-Dutch heritage could call themselves part of Knickerbocker, New York.
Right. And they formed Knickerbocker societies and clubs. And businesses took on the moniker of Knickerbocker in order to give themselves a sense of permanence, right? And history, and link themselves to the city's Anglo-Dutch heritage. And I think that this is what Washington Irving was referring to in that preface in the 1840s. Now, obviously, I jumped into newspapers.com and searched around and found plenty of examples from the 1840s from the newspapers. In the Baltimore Sun, there were ads throughout the 1840s for the Knickerbocker Bread and Fancy Cake Bakery. From New York, but operating in Baltimore. It was the, quote, largest bread ever offered to the public, 23 ounces for 6.5 cents, Greg. That was the Knickerbocker Bakery that was at 55 North Gay Street.
Lots of carbs. Quite a claim, actually. We see this today. You'll have a New York-style bakery in another place, but this one here is calling itself the Knickerbocker.
That's right. And there was a Knickerbocker steamship. I found a piece of breaking news, actually, in the Brooklyn Evening Star on April 16th, 1847, when the steamer Oregon pulled ahead of the steamer Knickerbocker while they were both passing through the Hell Gates, and actually the Oregon ran into it, ran into the Knickerbocker. And, quote, for a few minutes, the Knickerbocker was in very great peril, the anchor of the Oregon passing very near one of her boilers, unquote. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. Don't worry. It was not the fault of the Knickerbocker, nor of her captain, Greg, John Van Pelt.
Van Pelt? So like an old Knickerbocker himself. Perhaps his siblings, Linus and Lucy, were aboard as well. All here at the helm of the Knickerbocker steamship.
Exactly. And the examples go on and on. As you mentioned, yes, there was a horse-drawn omnibus called the Knickerbocker. It goes on and on.
But the steamship and the horse-drawn omnibus, well, these don't really sound like exclusive conveyances, right? I mean, this is just kind of sounding like an old-timey New York brand name by this point.
Yes, exactly. And I think that was also Irving's point, that already by the late 1840s, Knickerbocker was starting to just mean old-time New York, right? And in time, it would actually just come to represent New York itself.
But it is confusing, maybe even contradictory here because, despite those Knickerbocker bakeries and omnibuses, then the name would still hold some kind of social cachet throughout the whole 19th century, especially near the end of the century, as many more money types began flooding into the city, these nouveau riches.
Well, and that is a dynamic that we have watched play out for 3 seasons on HBO's The Gilded Age. It is that old Knickerbocker New York society versus the new money. Although, let's face it, even that is a little bit confusing because, the big drama in the early 1880s was whether Caroline Astor would permit Alva Vanderbilt into society. But you might be wondering, hold on, if we're just looking at names, Vanderbilt, right? Shouldn't that have been an automatic entry? That's an old Knickerbocker name. But of course, in their case, Mrs. Astor and her friend Ward McAllister considered the Vanderbilts not really far enough removed generationally from the man who built their fortune.
I just want to pause for a second and observe that this is a show about the New York Knicks, but we're up here with Ward McAllister, a bit far from the basketball court so far, in our usual fashion, of course.
We're getting there. This is our special spin on the Knicks. And this new money versus old money tension is important to the story because, among other things, it led to the formation of the ultra-exclusive Knickerbocker Club in 1871. That was formed by members of the Union Club who felt that their club was starting to just let in any old rich person or ultra-rich person. So they wanted to keep membership more restricted and, to notable descendants of Dutch and English settlers.
So here in 1871, despite the widespread use of the name on all sorts of different things, the Knickerbocker Club leaned into this haughtier meaning, perhaps, this earlier meaning, which represented this idea of prestigious Anglo-Dutch lineage.
Right. And at the same time that all of this is happening, a new persona emerges, right? A new character called Father Knickerbocker, emerging sometime in the 1870s. Father Knickerbocker was a kind of New York mascot, the same way that Uncle Sam is a mascot for the United States.
And Father Knickerbocker was not in Washington Irving's book?
No. He's just an evolution of this Knickerbocker idea and concept, right? Now, the New York history detective, Barry Poppick, published a post on his remarkable blog, barrypoppick.com, that tracked down Father Knickerbocker's first appearances. Barry found them as early as 1873 by going through the non-digitized archives of the New York Daily Graphic. When I searched the newspapers.com archive, which doesn't include the Daily Graphic, I found cartoons featuring Father Knickerbocker in the late 1880s. So kudos to Barry. But by the 1880s, the ones I saw, he was depicted as this decidedly old-fashioned, but I thought rather dashing Dutchman. He was wearing this long coat, frilly vest, buckles on his shoes, and of course, knee breeches.
Oh, well, so Father Knickerbocker has like a look. He's got some sass, maybe even like recalling a bit of Peter Stuyvesant in his look here even.
Yeah, just much, much later, right? And that was also the point that he was like outmoded. Although today we look at him and we're like, he's got a look. Yeah. So by the late 1850s, references to those knee breeches, those short pants, started to appear, calling them knickerbockers. And, boys would regularly wear their knickerbockers until they graduated to long pants. So they became very common. Everybody, talked about young boys in their knickerbockers. Yeah. And that term, because it's such a mouthful, would gradually, rather quickly, be shortened down to
knickers. Wearing my knickers.
No hemming and hawing around that one.
Wow. So by the late 1800s, the word Knickerbocker meant a lot of different things, many of which linked New Yorkers together in some way.
That's right. It could mean high-end, like the Hotel Knickerbocker, which was built by the Astors and opened in Times Square in 1906. The Hotel Knickerbocker was the original home to Maxfield Parrish's 30-foot mural, Old King Cole, for its bar, which now adorns the St. Regis. And the Hotel Knickerbocker is the rumored birthplace of the martini. So classy.
But it could also be more everyman, sticking here with the alcoholic spirits here, like Knickerbocker beer. Quote, the beer that satisfies, and was produced by the Jacob Rupert Brewery in Yorkville, in Manhattan. A brewery that was owned in the early 20th century by the Colonel Jacob Rupert Jr., who would purchase the Yankees, he would build Yankee Stadium, and would even bring Babe Ruth to New York, all with this backing of Knickerbocker beer.
So, pretty important. And I think it's safe to say that all of these terms, in all of these cases, Knickerbocker means New York. In her 2009 book, Knickerbocker, The Myth Behind New York, the author Elizabeth Bradley writes that, quote, it was Knickerbocker, not Irving, who was repurposed throughout the 19th century for a host of political, commercial, and social agendas. And it was Knickerbocker's name that was soon in near continuous use as shorthand for all things New York. Knickerbocker was the common link between a strange, sometimes unholy assemblage of New Yorkers, one that came to include nativists, patriots, and pulp fiction writers, hat makers, spice merchants, and hoteliers, gossip columnists, society matrons, and sports fans.
All linked by Knickerbocker. And by the way, speaking of sports fans, the Rupert Yankees connection here isn't even the only Knickerbocker baseball connection.
No, there's actually, we skipped over an even more obvious one. The Knickerbocker Baseball Club had been founded way back in September 1845 by a man named Alexander Joy Cartwright and others, and it was likely named after Cartwright's volunteer fire department, which was the Knickerbocker Engine Company 12.
And we talked about this in a fairly recent show on baseball history. They played their first game in Hoboken at Elysian Fields on June 19th, 1846. So that is that's an anniversary that's coming up. It's 180 years ago.
And those New York Knickerbockers, the baseball team, would remain an active team into the 1870s when the team folded. And the name became available.
Oh, isn't that convenient? We'll get to those other New York Knickerbockers right after this halftime show. Now, in the last section, you mentioned the Knickerbocker Baseball Club, which was founded in 1845. So we can already say the Knickerbockers of some sort have been playing some kind of sport for almost 180 years.
Knickerbockers have been playing since before, actually, the very invention of basketball.
By several decades, in fact. Basketball was invented in 1891. By James Naismith in Springfield, Massachusetts. Now, of course, baseball and football are far older. I would call them wild sports because they were formed in communities and were played mostly by young men with a huge array of evolving rules, right? It would take many, many decades to kind of get to the more standardized rules of those sports. But basketball, on the other hand, I might call a tame sport.
And is that because it takes place on a relatively smaller playing surface with fewer players?
Partially, yes. It is a more contained sport in many ways, kind of like tennis, if you think about it. But also, I say that due to the man who invented it, this man, James Naismith, a Canadian with a degree in theology who worked for the YMCA, or the Young Men's Christian Association.
That does sound tamer. Yes.
Yes.
Of course, it's terrible, but you said YMCA, and I started thinking of the Village People. They did not, we should add, have a basketball player, right, in the band?
No. They had a construction worker. I think there was a cop. There was a leather man, even. But
he might have played basketball.
Oh, well, maybe. And other sports. But no basketball player. So Naismith invented the game to keep his athletes in shape during the winter. And so the first game, I love that we know the first game, the date. And the first game was played on December 21st, 1891, with peach baskets standing in for the modern net baskets that we have today. Isn't that quaint? The rules were different, but there were rules. It was organized and supervised.
And you say standing in, the peach basket stood in, but I mean, it does make sense, right? It's called basketball. Baskets don't normally have a hole on, at the end of them.
That's true.
You
Good point.
Throwing the ball up and, I think the janitor had to come out and put a ladder up to it and take it out of the basket after every time somebody scored. So this was always meant as a sport for children, right? Or for young people.
Yes, for boys and young men and girls. For the very first girls' game was played on March 22nd, 1893, over at Smith College. This is so eye-opening. Did you realize that basketball was a Gilded Age invention?
No. But however, judging from the millionaires and billionaires who sit courtside today, it tracks. But I then imagine, so it became a popular sport in schools, right? I mean, today we know it as both a street sport and one that is played in school gymnasiums. It is so versatile. But it got its start here as something distinctly amateur.
Yeah. So it was popularized then by public schools, but also by the military. You could play this, if you had a cafeteria or a gym sitting around, you could have a game of basketball. Yeah, it was competitive, it was athletic, but it wasn't overly chaotic, if you know what I mean, like early baseball could be. By 1897, there was a professional organization which linked these YMCA teams. It was called the National Basketball League, or the NBL. That was composed of several teams, all in the Northeast. And the most famous one being the New York Wanderers, who had originally formed out of the 23rd Street YMCA at West 23rd Street in Chelsea.
And why were they called the Wanderers?
Well, they did indeed wander around, or barnstorm, as it's called today, playing exhibition matches in small towns. According to sports historian Robert Peterson, quote, "The Wanderers scheduled midweek games in towns with easy railroad travel of New York so that they could return home after a game for their regular jobs or studies. The Wanderers were sufficiently well known by 1901 that they were asked to endorse a spring tonic manufactured by Hood's Laboratories in Lowell, Massachusetts. Each player got $5 and a complimentary bottle. They came to regret this as they were subjected to endless kidding by other teams who had seen their endorsement in the company's advertisements," unquote.
I mean, it was a team who had formed at the YMCA after all. I'm sure that, going pro here and getting paid to, push tonics
yes,
was probably going to cost your reputation a little bit.
Yes. In fact, Luther Halsey Gulick, who was the superintendent from that YMCA in Springfield, Massachusetts, the one I mentioned earlier, he was once quoted as saying, "When men commence to make money out of sport, it degenerates with most tremendous speed. It has in the past inevitably resulted in men of lower character going into the game," unquote.
Yikes. Well, that seems like a rather untenable position to keep as basketball becomes increasingly popular here.
Yeah.
And also as its athletes become more skilled at the game.
I mean, there are certainly echoes of this argument even today in regards to college sports. Eventually, teams would discover that this barnstorming way was actually a pretty great way to make money. The barnstorming circuit also gave rise to teams of black players who couldn't even play in YMCAs originally because they were segregated.
In 1910, there would eventually be YMCAs constructed specifically for African American members, but the organization would hold on to a policy of segregation until 1946.
But on the barnstorming circuit, this gave teams the ability to create an unofficial league. In 1923, a team was formed in Harlem called the New York Renaissance, named for the Renaissance Ballroom, which was an actual ballroom in Harlem where jazz legends often played. A lot of things went on at the Renaissance Ballroom, but it was also a basketball arena.
Yeah. Again, demonstrating the versatility of the sport, right? And why it was so easy for teams to travel around because they could play in almost any room. Just had to put up some baskets.
Yes. But I just want to, like a little side note here, because there is another team which formed in the 1920s that still performs today. And that team is called the Harlem Globetrotters, an exhibition team which was actually founded 100 years ago in 1926.
And let's face it, they were all the rage when we were kids.
Yes.
I saw them play in Cleveland. I don't know about you.
Oh, you did? Oh, wow.
I mean, they also appeared on Saturday morning cartoons.
They even teamed up with Scooby-Doo. I mean, if you've not watched that, I suggest you go find that cartoon. Just magical.
It seemed to me like they were on for a long time, right? It was a whole spin-off.
I think it was just not a lot of shows, but like they just it was on all the time when we were kids.
It was like Arnold going over to the Facts of Life.
Yes.
But were the Globetrotters founded in Harlem?
No, they were actually founded in Chicago. But by the year 1926, Harlem had become so synonymous as the Mecca of Black culture in the United States that they just added Harlem to the name, because it was a popular name. But here in New York, back to New York, the most famous team of the 1920s and 30s, all the way downtown, was a team called the Original Celtics, due to the original members of that team all being Irish Americans. And they were so dominant in the sport in this early 20th century period that according to author Stephen A. Reese, quote, they often played more than 100 games a season and won 90% of the time. As many as 10,000 fans attended Celtics games, often breaking arena attendance records, unquote.
And to be clear here, you're talking about non-collegiate basketball because
yes.
I'm going to get to in a second here, college basketball was where all the action was.
Right. This is an important distinction.
And by the 1920s, these early professional basketball teams were becoming too big to ignore. Now, at the same time, in the 1920s, baseball teams, they all had venues of their own, like the Polo Grounds, and of course, Yankee Stadium. So could these Celtics find themselves, a big venue of their own?
They would, in fact, and that venue would be named Madison Square Garden. Now, of course, this legendary place comes up all the time in our show. We reference Madison Square Garden all the time. Now, I direct our listeners back to our Madison Square Park episode that we did just a couple years ago for a capsule history on the original Madison Square Garden.
Yes, the one that actually sat next to Madison Square Park, across from the northeast corner of the park.
Yeah. Now, it had once been an old train shed that in the year 1874 was adapted to become a general entertainment venue called Gilmore's Garden, where you'd hear a lot of light orchestral music and things like that. So 5 years later, in 1879, the Vanderbilts, who we've already mentioned on this show, and they owned the land, they built a proper venue which introduced indoor sporting events to the spot. And then, of course, that became so popular that in 1890, an even more lavish arena was created here, designed by the one and only Stanford White. And so this was the center of popular entertainment in New York City for over 35 years. It hosted, oh my goodness, what didn't host? Horse shows, political conventions, of course, dog shows, operas,
circus.
Oh yeah, famously, boxing, football, bike racing, all kinds of things.
Basically, the same thing that your modern general purpose arena would host today.
Oh, yeah. I mean, had it been like the year 2024 and had it still been there, Taylor Swift probably would have brought her Eras tour to the northeast corner of Madison Square Park.
It was a different era.
Yes.
So did the original Celtics then play basketball there at Madison Square Park?
No, they actually helped inaugurate a new Madison Square Garden away from Madison Square up on 8th Avenue in the neighborhood of Hell's Kitchen today, operated by boxing promoter Tex Ricard as a more sports forward venue, not meant for proper society, let's just say, okay? It was more focused. It would be known as the house that Tex built, and to show that he was serious about making a big change away from, the Gilded Age 19th century Madison Square Garden, on December 6th, 1925, he hosted a game here at the new venue between the original Celtics and a DC-based team called the Washington Palace 5.
And were these teams really organized at this point? This wasn't just this kind of barnstorming that they had been doing?
There was a professional league by this time called the American Basketball League. You don't need to remember all of these different leagues because this particular one crumbled in the 1930s, like so many other things during the Great Depression, and other attempts to revitalize this league failed to take off. So basically, by the 1930s, professional basketball in New York City was at a bit of a crossroads.
But fortunately, as I hinted at before, there was college basketball. Now, in 1934, a sports writer and event promoter named Ned Irish was dreaming up ways to fill the Garden on nights when there were neither boxing matches nor hockey games or anything else. And on December 29th, 1934, he organized a collegiate doubleheader. A collegiate basketball doubleheader featuring Westminster College versus St. John's and NYU versus Notre Dame. And more than 16,000 fans packed the arena.
Wow. I mean, suddenly here in the 30s, this college game seems to be where it's at. This seems to be the big business.
It was already huge. I mean, it was so popular that Ned Irish, when he had been reporting on games for the New York World Telegram, allegedly had torn his pants trying to squeeze through a window into a packed college auditorium. And he realized just how popular they would and how he could actually make more money promoting these basketball events in a much larger house, Madison Square Garden, which he knew sat quiet on some nights when there was nothing else going on there, this also being the Depression. So nothing happening there, no revenue. What did they have to lose?
Well, I mean, this sounds like a pretty savvy decision. It kind of made him a very rich man.
It did. In 1934, it made him the Garden's basketball director. And he also got a cut of the ticket sales. And so the popularity of college basketball continued to grow, including with the introduction in 1938 of the National Invitation Tournament, which helped make New York the, quote, Mecca of basketball.
Oh, wow.
So brought everybody to New York. And this just continued to grow so that by the early 1940s, hundreds of thousands of spectators were descending upon Madison Square Garden every season for college basketball games, with an average attendance of more than 15,000 spectators per game by 1944.
I love this fact, too, because now that we have college basketball here, the very first basketball game that was ever broadcast for television was a college game. And it was here at Madison Square Garden between Fordham and the University of Pittsburgh on February 28th, 1940. Okay?
Wow.
1940. It was on an experimental station, W2XBS, and was broadcast to approximately 400 television sets. Fortunately, very few were watching Fordham get destroyed by Pittsburgh that evening, 57-37.
I bet the ad rates were cheap for that one. But of course, that would change very quickly.
So then, when did the pro teams come to town?
Right. So at about the same time. And here's the sort of ironic part of this story. Professional basketball wasn't actually conjured up by basketball people. It was actually dreamed up by a room full of guys who owned hockey arenas.
Hockey arenas? Huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Giant arenas in Boston, in Providence, Rhode Island, Cleveland, Detroit. These places sat dark and empty on the nights when there were no hockey matches. There's no money being made then. So these owners thought, well, what if we put a basketball team in there to fill, those dark nights? It was a real estate play.
So a little bit like Ned Irish and his college basketball doubleheaders, it was kind of a similar idea, just to fill the empty building.
Exactly. Yeah. So on June 6th, 1946, a group of these arena owners gathered together at the Commodore Hotel, located right next to Grand Central, and founded a new professional basketball league called the Basketball Association of America, the BAA.
The BAA?
Yeah, I know.
Not the NBA?
Not yet. I know we're throwing around a lot of team names, a lot of letters here, but the man that they put in charge of this new league was Maurice Podolov, who was a lawyer who was already running a pro hockey league, and now he was running a basketball league at the same time.
And so I am imagining that one of the arena owners in this room was our friend Ned Irish.
Yes, Mr. Irish is in the room. He's the one man there who actually knows basketball really well because he has been actually making a fortune off of the college games at the Garden at this point for 12 years. And New York was the biggest prize, in the entire league. But the question became, who gets to own the New York team?
Well, I mean, it's Irish, right? I mean, he's got the venue.
Well, there was another New Yorker who wanted to own the New York franchise, even more than Irish, one could argue.
Okay.
A sports writer named Max Case, who reported for the New York Journal-American. And he had actually been promoting this idea of a professional basketball team for New York for many years. He had it all figured out, and he wanted them to play in Manhattan out of an old armory building.
Oh, so Case, he's the dreamer. He's the one with like the big ideas and with the vision. But of course, he doesn't really have the space.
Exactly. And by 1946, the man who was now running the whole Madison Square Garden operation was our friend Ned Irish. He was now the president of the Madison Square Garden Corporation. It had been quite a climb from his days as a college basketball reporter. And he wanted that New York team to play at the Garden.
And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that he basically controlled the most important building in basketball, like the whole sport.
Right, because any professional team who was playing in New York would really have to play in the Garden, and that would have to go through Irish. But according to the minutes of the meeting, which still exist, they couldn't decide what to do when they voted. Quote, action deferred on New York.
Well, I think we know what happened.
That's right.
I mean, right?
Yeah, the franchise,
we know where this goes.
The franchise went to Irish and to Madison Square Garden, and Case, the dreamer, got squeezed out.
It's too bad, but there is a little touch of irony here because just 6 years later, because he's a journalist, Max Case would actually go on to win a Pulitzer Prize for exposing a bribery scandal in basketball and at Madison Square Garden. So, I mean, I guess you could say he got the last word on this.
He scored.
but
it's like a three-pointer. Yeah.
So Irish got his New York team, but this is important, and it's really, we've been leading up to it the whole show. This team doesn't have a name yet.
Right. Yeah. This is where the whole story comes full circle. Remember that other part of the show when we were talking about Knickerbocker? Well,
and Ward McAllister.
Ward McAllister. We're coming back to it. Irish and his staff, now with the franchise under their control, sat down to name the team. And according to an oft retold story, they each wrote a suggestion on a slip of paper and dropped it into a hat to vote.
Do we know what kind of hat? Was it like an old Dutch cocked hat? Was it a fedora?
A long stovepipe?
Yeah.
Don't know. But when they pulled out the slips and counted them, the winner by a wide margin was the Knickerbockers. Named after Father Knickerbocker, the symbol of New York City.
And derived from Diedrich Knickerbocker, plucked from Washington Irving's imagination.
And a name that, of course, would soon be shortened to the Knicks.
So of all the names that they could have chosen.
The Dead Rabbits,
right? I mean,
the Plug Uglies.
I mean, Tom, they could have chosen the Bowery Boys, actually. I mean,
we probably would have been able to name this the Bowery Boys.
Yes, that's out there at the time. So, anyway.
No, they voted for the oldest, most New York name there was, the fake Dutchman that Washington Irving invented in 1809, sitting in a hotel room in his cocked hat and knee breeches. And that's how Father Knickerbocker's name went onto those jerseys.
Well, and speaking of, the original Knicks logo back in 1946 literally was Father Knickerbocker. Right? It was a little cartoon Dutchman in his actual knee breeches doing something which I don't think would be comfortable doing in breeches, dribbling a basketball. I think it'd kind of ride up, wouldn't you? What do you think?
And what colors, Greg, did they choose for their logo and for their jerseys?
Well, they chose the colors orange, blue, and white, which were the colors of New York City.
Which, of course, had taken those very colors from the flag of the Dutch Republic. So the team that's playing for the city right now is quite literally New Amsterdam proud.
Although we should say that their very first game on November 1st, 1946, was not even in New York.
No.
Or was not even in the United States, actually.
No, it was played in Toronto at the Maple Leaf Gardens. The Knicks against the Toronto Huskies. And it's the only game on the schedule that whole night, which is why the NBA, the subsequent basketball organization, today counts it as the very first game in NBA league history.
The first NBA game ever was Knicks Huskies in Canada. And actually, I mean, that's kind of a historic name for Toronto as well.
Yeah. And the first basket ever scored in the league was put up by a Knick, a guard from Queens named Ossie Schechtman. And by the way, New York won 68-66. But back home, the Knicks, turns out, were kind of an afterthought in their own home building, right? Because when the college teams wanted to play at the Garden, the Knicks got bumped, sometimes all the way downtown to the dingy old 69th Regiment Armory on 25th Street.
So, kind of wrapping it up here, we can say that the Knicks have come a long way, a very, very long way.
Because here we are in June 2026, and for the first time since 1999, the New York Knickerbockers are playing for an NBA championship.
Against the San Antonio Spurs, the exact same team that beat the Knicks in the finals back in 1999. So this is a rematch 27 years later.
And however it turns out this time, we have our preference, but however it turns out, it is all a very long way from a certain fake Dutchman in knee breeches.
We have come very far from the satirist who sat down in 1809 and invented an old man who never existed, right? Diedrich Knickerbocker invented him just to sell a book. And 2 centuries later, that made-up name is stitched across the chests of a team cheered on by more than 8 million New Yorkers.
So to answer our question, why Knickerbocker? Because by 1946, the name was the New Yorkiest name there was.
And probably still is, actually. So when you're watching the finals, and there are close-ups of the famous faces in the Garden, Spike Lee, Timothy Chalamet, just look past them, up at the rafters, because there'll be a little old man in knee breeches and a cocked hat sitting there and smiling down at the whole thing.
The spirit of Washington Irving having a last laugh.
So thank you for listening and for watching our show today. This episode is brought to you by our listeners, our supporters on patreon.com/BoweryBoys. Every contribution made through Patreon goes straight into the production of this show, including the editing, some travel, distribution, and of course, you can watch us on YouTube as well, and that's thanks to our supporters on Patreon.
That's right. Yes, our new YouTube channel over at youtube.com. Just search for Bowery Boys Podcast. So for a small monthly contribution, when you join us at Patreon, you'll also get access to Bowery Boys classic podcasts. And you'll also have first dibs on tickets to our live events on top of our other show, which is called Side Streets, which is exclusive to those who support the show. And it is also available on video as well.
So join the fun over at patreon.com/BoweryBoys. And thank you for supporting the Bowery Boys podcast.
Thank you so much.
Yes, and thank you all for listening today. Have a great New York week, whether you live here or not.
See you real soon. And
Go
Knickerbockers!